cancel the $4 billion investment immediately, and pull every single software license holding their entire airline fleet in the air before the sun goes down. That was the command that would eventually bring one of the largest aviation giants in the world to its knees. But on a crisp, foggy Monday morning at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, nobody in Terminal 3 had the slightest clue what was coming. The airport was moving with its usual relentless, mechanical rhythm. Rolling suitcases rattled across the polished terrazzo floors like distant gunfire, espresso machines hissed violently behind packed coffee counters, and flight announcements echoed hollowly beneath the sweeping glass ceilings as thousands of travelers rushed toward their gates. Julian Vance arrived at Gate 4 nearly 2 hours before departure, walking with the unhurried, measured stride of a man who had long ago mastered the art of patience. Success had never made him restless or arrogant. If anything, building a multi-billion-dollar investment firm from the ground up had taught him that rushing usually meant missing the subtle details that mattered most. He was dressed in a way that intentionally invited no special attention. Dark, well-fitted jeans, a light gray button-down shirt with the sleeves neatly rolled to his forearms, and a pair of comfortable brown leather loafers that had clearly been polished dozens of times over the years. His leather carry-on bag showed small, gentle scuffs around the corners, proving he was a man who valued durability and quiet utility over flashy, short-lived luxury. Nothing about his physical presence shouted wealth, except perhaps for the understated vintage timepiece tucked quietly beneath his left cuff. Julian found a quiet seat near the window, overlooking the foggy tarmac, opened a folded financial journal, and began to read. A few yards away, an elderly woman traveling alone was struggling with a heavy rolling suitcase whose front wheel had gotten wedged in the metallic divider where the carpet met the tile. She let out a small, anxious sigh, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to yank the heavy bag free. Julian set his journal down, stood up, and walked over with a gentle smile. "May I give you a hand with that, ma'am?" he asked softly. The woman looked up, her worried face instantly softening with relief. "Oh, bless you, young man," she murmured. "These airports seem to get bigger every year while my strength gets smaller." With one smooth, practiced motion, Julian lifted the bag clear of the ridge and set it down smoothly on the polished floor. The woman beamed at him, offering a warm thank you before continuing down the concourse. However, across the waiting area, another couple had been watching the entire exchange with cold, deliberate scrutiny. Arthur Pembroke, a senior partner at a prominent private equity firm, adjusted the crisp French cuffs of his tailored navy suit and turned to his wife, Evelyn. Evelyn, draped in an expensive cashmere scarf and clutching a designer leather handbag, narrowed her eyes as she looked Julian up and down, taking in his plain gray shirt, his scuffed leather bag, and the calm, unbothered way he carried himself. "He certainly doesn't look like he belongs in first class," Evelyn whispered, her voice carrying a sharp edge of condescension that cut through the ambient airport noise. Arthur followed Julian with a cold, analytical stare, his lips pressing into a thin line. "No, he certainly doesn't," Arthur agreed quietly. "Probably used mid-tier frequent flyer points just to squeeze into the front of the cabin." Neither of them had ever spoken a single word to Julian Vance. Neither of them knew his name, his background, or the staggering economic power he wielded in the financial world. Yet, within 10 seconds of visual assessment, both had already constructed a complete narrative about his worth, his status, and his right to occupy the same physical space as them. Julian caught the brief, icy glare from Arthur Pembroke as he walked back to his seat, but he simply sat down, picked up his paper, and let the quiet dignity of his silence speak for itself. He had lived long enough as a successful black man in corporate America to know that prejudice was rarely loud at first. It almost always began with subtle glances, quiet dismissals, and the silent assumption that a person of his background had to prove his right to exist in places of comfort. When the boarding call for Flight 412 to Dallas was finally announced, the line for first-class passengers formed along the carpeted lane. Julian Vance waited patiently near the back of the priority line, deliberately allowing others to pass ahead of him because he saw no reason to push forward, simply because his ticket granted him privilege. When he stepped onto the aircraft, the familiar smell of jet fuel, polished leather, and warm coffee filled the cabin. Sunlight streamed through the oval windows, illuminating the plush cream-colored leather seats of the premium section. Julian located seat 2A beside the window, carefully stowed his scuffed leather bag in the overhead compartment, settled into the comfortable leather seat, and reopened his newspaper. A moment later, Arthur and Evelyn Pembroke boarded the plane. Arthur checked the seat numbers overhead, saw that their assigned seats, 2B and 2C, were directly adjacent to Julian, and paused in the aisle. His expression turned instantly sour, as if the airline had committed a personal offense against his dignity. Evelyn let out a sharp, audible exhale, pulling her cashmere scarf tighter around her neck and gripping her handbag against her chest with exaggerated tension as she slid past Julian into the middle seat. The physical message was unmissable. She was treating Julian not as a fellow traveler, but as a potential threat to her personal belongings. Before Julian could even turn the page of his paper, a shadow fell across his lap. Flight attendant Victoria Hayes stood over his row. Victoria was a veteran crew member with a perfectly pressed uniform and a smile that appeared polished, professional, and completely devoid of warmth. Just moments earlier, Julian had watched Victoria greet two white executives in row, one with cheerful enthusiasm, hanging their suit jackets with care and offering them complimentary glasses of sparkling wine. But as she turned her attention to seat 2A, her smile vanished, replaced by a tense, guarded mask. "Sir, I need to see your boarding pass," Victoria said, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of surrounding passengers. Julian looked up from his newspaper, keeping his voice level and polite. "Of course," he replied smoothly, reaching into his pocket and handing her his digital boarding pass on his phone. Victoria took the phone, but instead of simply scanning the QR code or confirming the seat number, she began tapping aggressively on her screen. She cross-referenced the name on her tablet, looked up at Julian's face, looked back down at the screen, and then checked his physical appearance a second time. Across the aisle in seat 2D, a 22-year-old nursing student named Maya Lawson lowered her textbook and began watching the interaction closely. Maya had noticed that Victoria had walked right past a white passenger in row 3, whose oversized duffel bag was visibly blocking the main aisle, yet Victoria was now spending nearly 2 full minutes scrutinizing a black man who was sitting silently in his assigned seat. Victoria handed the phone back, her jaw tight. "Is there an issue with the ticket?" Julian asked gently. "Just a routine security verification, sir," Victoria replied, her tone dripping with passive-aggressive formality. "Did the system flag something specific?" Julian inquired calmly. "Or, am I the only passenger in this cabin being asked to verify their identity after boarding?" Victoria's cheeks flushed slightly, her eyes narrowing. "I am simply performing my duties to ensure cabin security, Mr. Vance. I suggest you cooperate without making a scene." Arthur Pembroke leaned over from seat 2B, clearing his throat loudly. "Excuse me, miss?" Arthur said to Victoria, his voice dripping with entitlement. "Are there any open seats further back in economy? My wife is feeling extremely uncomfortable up here, and frankly, we would prefer to know that the people sitting next to us have been properly vetted." Evelyn offered a subtle, nervous nod, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on the floor, as if refusing to acknowledge Julian's humanity. Julian turned his head slowly toward Arthur. His expression was completely composed, his eyes steady and unblinking. "My name is Julian Vance," he said quietly to Arthur. "I hold a confirmed first-class ticket for seat 2A. You have no reason to feel unsafe, nor do you have the right to question my presence here." Arthur stiffened instantly, as if Julian's calm, direct words were a physical insult. "Don't you take that tone with me?" Arthur snapped, raising his voice slightly to command the room. "Miss Hayes, this man is being openly confrontational and aggressive toward my wife and me." Victoria Hayes immediately pulled her cabin tablet against her chest, her face hardening into absolute hostility. "That is enough, sir," Victoria said to Julian, ignoring the fact that Arthur had been the one to escalate the exchange. "You are creating a disturbance in the cabin. I am going to ask you one last time to lower your tone, or I will be forced to involve flight operations." Julian looked at Victoria, then at Arthur, feeling a familiar, cold weight settle behind his ribs. It was not fear, nor was it surprise. It was the painful recognition of an old, persistent pattern, the quiet, calculated way authority could be weaponized to turn a black man's calm dignity into false evidence of aggression. The tension inside the first-class cabin thickened until the air felt heavy and suffocating. Around row 2, conversations trickled to a sudden stop. Passengers in the rows behind turned in their seats, peering over the plush headrests to watch the drama unfold. Julian Vance remained seated, his hands folded peacefully in his lap, his breathing slow and even. He knew precisely what game was being played. They were waiting for him to lose his temper. They were waiting for him to raise his voice, to wave his hands, or to express the natural, human frustration that any innocent person would feel when publicly humiliated. They needed him to act out so that their prejudice could pretend to be policy. Victoria Hayes did not wait for Julian to speak another word. She walked quickly to the front bulkhead, picked up the crew interphone, and pressed the button for the flight deck. "Captain Miller," she said into the receiver, her voice pitched with artificial urgency, "I need you in the forward cabin immediately. We have an uncooperative passenger in seat 2A who is creating an unsafe environment for the surrounding guests." Across the aisle, Maya Lawson felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Julian, who was sitting silently, reading the headlines on his newspaper. Then she looked at Arthur Pembroke, who was smirking quietly to himself while leaning over to whisper something in his wife's ear. Maya reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her smartphone, and quietly began recording the entire scene, ensuring the camera had a clear, unobstructed view of Julian's calm posture and Victoria's escalating actions. A moment later, Captain David Miller stepped out of the cockpit. He was a tall man in his early 50s with silvering hair and 4 gold stripes gleaming on the shoulders of his crisp white shirt. Captain Miller walked down the aisle with the practiced, commanding authority of a man accustomed to making absolute decisions. Victoria leaned in close, whispering a rapid stream of exaggerated claims into his ear, words like defiant, intimidating, and refusing crew instructions. Captain Miller stopped beside row 2 and looked down at Julian. "Sir, I am the captain of this aircraft," Miller said, his voice flat and unyielding. "My crew reports that you are refusing to cooperate and causing a disruption. I need you to step out into the jet bridge with me so we can resolve this matter." Julian looked up into the captain's eyes. "Captain, I have presented my boarding pass twice. I have remained seated. I have not raised my voice once. The only disruption occurring in this cabin is coming from the passenger beside me, who feels uncomfortable simply sharing a row with a black man." Captain Miller's jaw tightened. He did not want an explanation. He wanted a fast operational solution. Flight 412 had a tight departure slot, and every minute spent debating meant a potential delay that would reflect poorly on his performance metrics. To Captain Miller, Julian was not a human being who was being wronged. He was an operational variable causing a delay. "Sir, the flight crew has final authority regarding cabin safety," Miller said firmly. "If my lead flight attendant states that she feels uncomfortable proceeding with you on board, I have to support that assessment. Please step off the plane." Before Julian could answer, heavy, metallic footsteps echoed down the jet bridge. 2 uniformed airport security officers pushed through the forward cabin door. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man named Eric Thorne, walked straight to Julian's row, his hand resting casually on the utility belt near his holster. "Sir, gather your personal items and step off the aircraft immediately," Officer Thorne commanded, his voice booming through the quiet cabin. "Am I being placed under arrest?" Julian asked calmly. "No, but you are being removed from this flight at the captain's request," Thorne replied, stepping closer until he was towering directly over Julian's seat. "Now don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Across the aisle, Maya Lawson spoke up, her voice trembling slightly with anger. "Officer, he hasn't done anything wrong. I've been sitting right here the whole time. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't threaten anyone, and the flight attendant singled him out from the moment he sat down. Ma'am, stay out of this and put that phone away." Officer Thorne snapped without looking at her. He then reached down, grabbed Julian tightly by the upper arm, and pulled him upward out of his seat. Julian felt the cold, hard pressure of the officer's fingers biting into his arm. He did not pull away, nor did he resist physically. He slowly stood up, reached into the overhead compartment, pulled down his scuffed leather bag, and looked Officer Thorne directly in the eyes. For 3 long seconds, Julian's gaze held such profound, unshakable dignity that Officer Thorne involuntarily loosened his grip and took half a step back. Julian turned to Maya Lawson, offering her a subtle, grateful nod. "Keep that video safe," he said softly. As Julian walked down the narrow aisle toward the exit, the cabin was dead silent. Arthur Pembroke looked away, pretending to read a Sky Mall magazine, while Evelyn stared intently at her manicured nails. Victoria Hayes stood near the galley with her arms folded, her expression filled with cold, self-righteous satisfaction. Julian stepped out of the aircraft and onto the carpeted ramp of the jet bridge. Behind him, the heavy metal door of Flight 412 slammed shut with a definitive, hydraulic thud, locking him out. Officer Thorne walked alongside him, leaning in slightly as they approached the terminal gate. "People like you always think the rules don't apply," Thorne muttered under his breath. Julian stopped walking. The air in the jet bridge seemed to freeze. Julian turned his head slowly and looked at Thorne. There was no rage in Julian's eyes, no desperation, and no fear. There was only absolute, crushing authority. Thorne swallowed hard, his arrogant smirk instantly evaporating under the weight of Julian's gaze. Julian didn't say a word to the officer. He walked out into the busy terminal, pulled his phone from his pocket, and dialed a private number. In Chicago, his executive assistant, Devin Cole, answered on the second ring. "Mr. Vance, I thought you were in the air." Julian stood by the large plate glass window, watching Flight 412 push back from Gate 4. "Devin," Julian said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Call the board of Apex Airways. Cancel the $4 billion expansion loan effective immediately. Then, contact our legal division and revoke their corporate licensing for the AeroCore scheduling platform before the sun goes down." On the other end of the line, Devin went dead silent. He knew that tone. It was the tone Julian used only when an empire was about to fall. "Consider it done, sir," Devin replied. Inside the first-class cabin of Flight 412, the heavy jet engines roared to life, vibrating through the floorboards as the aircraft taxied toward the runway. Arthur Pembroke settled deeper into his plush leather seat, letting out a long, contented sigh of relief. He adjusted his silk tie and smiled at his wife, Evelyn, who was finally relaxing her grip on her designer handbag. "Well, that was uncomfortable," Arthur remarked in a hushed tone, shaking his head with condescending pity. "But honestly, it's about time airlines started taking cabin environments seriously. People like that need to understand that luxury spaces come with certain behavioral expectations." Evelyn offered a thin, approving smile. "You handled that brilliantly, darling. It's a relief to know we can enjoy a quiet flight to Dallas without feeling threatened." Little did Arthur know that 30 feet across the aisle, Maya Lawson had just connected to the plane's satellite Wi-Fi network. With a few quick taps on her phone, Maya uploaded the full, unedited video of the interaction to her social media account. She didn't add dramatic commentary or sensationalized claims. She simply wrote a factual, piercing caption. "Watch this innocent black man get harassed, interrogated, and forcibly thrown off Flight 412 after doing absolutely nothing wrong except existing in first class." The video uploaded within seconds. Because the footage was crystal clear, capturing Victoria's passive-aggressive interrogation, Arthur's baseless complaints, and Officer Thorne's physical aggression, it began to spread across the internet like wildfire. Within 45 minutes, while Flight 412 was still climbing to its cruising altitude over the Midwest, the video had reached over 2 million views. Retweets, shares, and furious commentary flooded the internet, picking up traction among national news journalists, civil rights advocates, and financial bloggers. At 35,000 feet, Arthur Pembroke's phone began to vibrate violently in his pocket. Then it vibrated again and again. A relentless cascade of notifications began flashing across his screen. Arthur frowned, pulling his phone out to see what was happening. He had dozens of missed calls from the senior founding partners of his private equity firm, Sterling, and Pembroke partners. There were also over 50 text messages, each one more frantic than the last. Confused and growing anxious, Arthur opened the top text message from his senior managing partner, Richard Sterling. "Arthur, what the hell did you just do on Flight 412? Turn on your phone data right now. Your face is on every major news network in the country." Arthur's heart took a sudden violent leap into his throat. His fingers trembled as he clicked a link attached to the message. A news headline popped up on his screen alongside a clear, high-definition screenshot of his own face, smirking while Julian Vance was being grabbed by security. The headline read, "Private equity partner Arthur Pembroke caught on camera instigating biased removal of billionaire investor Julian Vance." Arthur felt all the blood drain from his face. His breath hitched in his chest as he read the name again, Julian Vance. For the past 6 months, Arthur's entire firm had been desperately trying to land a monumental joint venture partnership with Vance Capital, a deal worth over $300 million in management fees alone that would have secured Arthur's financial legacy for the rest of his life. Arthur had personally submitted the proposal to Vance Capital's board just 2 weeks ago, hoping to meet the elusive, media-shy chairman Julian Vance in person. Another message flashed across Arthur's screen from Richard Sterling. "Vance Capital's legal team just formally severed all ties with our firm. They cited your actions on Flight 412. You just cost this firm hundreds of millions of dollars, Arthur. The board is convening an emergency session right now to vote on your immediate termination and partner divestment. Do not come into the office when you land." Arthur stared at the glowing screen, his hands shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the phone onto the carpeted floor. Cold sweat broke out across his forehead, soaking into his tailored collar. He turned his head slowly to look at the empty seat. The quiet, humble man, in the plain gray shirt, whom Arthur had judged, humiliated, and thrown off the plane. "Arthur?" Evelyn asked, noticing her husband's ghostly pale complexion. "Darling, what's wrong? You look sick." Arthur couldn't speak. The sheer, terrifying weight of his mistake crushed down upon him. He had thought he was asserting his social dominance over a man who didn't belong. Instead, he had just destroyed his own career, ruined his reputation, and bankrupted his family's future, all because he couldn't stomach sitting next to a black billionaire in first class. 1,500 miles away, inside the glass-walled executive conference room at Apex Airways headquarters in Dallas, Chief Executive Officer Harrison Croft was in the middle of leading a quarterly strategy meeting. Croft was a ruthless, corporate traditionalist who viewed airline management through a cold lens of profit margins, stock buybacks, and cost reduction. He was a man who hated surprises, hated public scrutiny, and believed that corporate authority should never be questioned. Without knocking, Croft's vice president of communications, Sarah Jenkins, burst into the conference room. Her face was pale, and she was carrying a tablet computer in her trembling hands. "Harrison, we have a catastrophic situation unfolding," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the executive presentation. Croft frowned, adjusting his silk tie with annoyance. "Sarah, I am in the middle of presenting our third-quarter projections to the executive board. Whatever operational delay you're referring to can wait." "No, Harrison, it cannot wait," Sarah insisted, stepping forward and placing the tablet directly in front of him on the polished mahogany table. "We have a viral video spreading across every social media platform and news outlet in North America. It already has 12 million views, and it's rising by 1 million every 10 minutes. Croft sneered, pushing the tablet away with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "A viral video? What is it this time? A delayed bag? A flight attendant arguing over an overhead bin? Draft a standard boilerplate apology, expressing our commitment to customer satisfaction, offer the passenger a $200 flight voucher, and let the news cycle burn itself out by tomorrow morning." "Harrison, look at the screen," Sarah pleaded, her voice rising with genuine desperation. Croft sighed heavily, picked up the tablet, and pressed play. He watched as Victoria Hayes interrogated a black man sitting peacefully in C2A. He watched as Captain Miller summoned security. And he watched as Officer Eric Thorne physically pulled the man out of his seat, while surrounding passengers protested. Croft leaned back in his leather chair, a cold, arrogant smirk touching his lips. The crew followed procedure. The passenger was deemed uncooperative by the lead flight attendant. We have strict safety protocols regarding cabin authority. Issue a press statement backing the flight crew's decision to prioritize passenger comfort and safety. Sarah looked at him as if he had completely lost his mind. Harrison, you don't understand who that passenger is, she whispered, her voice shaking. That man in seat 2A is Julian Vance. The entire conference room went instantly dead silent. The executive board members sitting around the table froze, their eyes widening in absolute horror. Croft's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. Julian Vance? Croft repeated, his voice suddenly hollow and thin. The chairman of Vance Capital? Yes, Sarah replied, holding up a fresh printout of a financial press release that had just been issued 5 minutes prior. And Vance Capital's executive board has officially issued a formal notice. They have frozen our $4 billion credit line for the fleet expansion program. The funds were supposed to clear our accounts at midnight. They're gone, Harrison. Croft felt a sudden, sickening knot tighten in his stomach. The $4 billion expansion deal was the cornerstone of his entire legacy as CEO. Without those funds, Apex Airways would be unable to purchase the new fuel-efficient jets required to maintain their international routes, sending their stock value into a tailspin. Call Julian Vance's office immediately, Croft ordered, his voice rising in pitch as panic began to set in. Get him on the phone! Tell him there was a terrible misunderstanding. Tell him I will personally fly to Chicago on a private jet to apologize. It gets worse, Harrison, Sarah added quietly. Julian Vance isn't just an investor. Vance Capital owns a majority stake in AeroCore Systems, the software company that hosts our entire flight scheduling and ticketing infrastructure. Their legal team just delivered a formal notice of contract review. If they pull our software license, every single Apex Airways plane across the globe will be grounded within 48 hours. Late that afternoon, inside the quiet, sunlit top-floor offices of Vance Capital in downtown Chicago, Julian Vance sat at the head of a long glass conference table. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline glowed in the amber light of the setting sun. Below, city traffic moved like tiny ribbons of light, completely oblivious to the financial earthquake that was currently shattering the aviation industry. Julian's executive assistant, Devin Cole, stood near a digital whiteboard, while Vance Capital's chief legal counsel, Grace Mercer, sat beside Julian with a thick leather file folder open before her. Julian, the response from Apex Airways has been frantic, Devin reported, referencing his tablet. CEO Harrison Croft has called your private line 9 times in the past 3 hours. Their board chairman, Gavin Prescott, has sent 4 urgent emails requesting an immediate private meeting. Julian sat calmly, his hands clasped together on the polished glass table. He had changed out of his travel clothes into a tailored charcoal suit, looking every bit the formidable financial titan he was. They aren't calling because they regret what happened to me in seat 2A, Julian said quietly, his voice measured and deep. They are calling because they finally realized that the man they humiliated has the power to hold them accountable. What did our legal review discover, Grace? Grace Mercer pulled a stack of printed documents from her folder, her expression grim. Julian, what happened to you on Flight 412? Wasn't an isolated mistake by a bad flight attendant. It is part of an underlying operational culture within Apex Airways that has been protected for over a decade. Grace slid the documents across the table toward Julian. Over the past 10 years, Apex Airways has quietly settled 14 separate civil rights complaints involving passengers of color who were harassed, interrogated, or forcibly removed from first-class and business-class cabins. Every single settlement included a strict, non-disclosure agreement and a financial payout designed to keep the victims quiet. Julian turned the pages slowly, reading the brief summaries of the victims. A retired military officer removed from business class after a white passenger questioned his ticket. A female physician repeatedly asked to show identification while trying to store her medical bag. An elderly grandmother reported for suspicious movement because she asked for water to take her medication. 14 people, Julian murmured softly, a deep, profound sorrow touching his eyes. 14 people who were publicly humiliated, made to feel small, and forced to suffer in silence because they didn't have the financial leverage to fight back. And it goes deeper, Grace added, pointing to a name highlighted at the bottom of a compliance audit from 3 years ago. 3 years ago, Apex Airways had a director of compliance named Lydia Warren. Lydia uncovered these exact patterns and attempted to institute a mandatory civil rights re-education program for all flight crews and ground staff. But when she presented her findings to CEO Harrison Croft, her department was abruptly gutted and she was terminated under the guise of corporate restructuring. Julian closed the folder slowly, his jaw set in a firm, unyielding line. His desire for accountability had transformed into something far larger than personal vindication. "Find Lydia Warren," Julian instructed Devon softly. "Contact her legal team and offer her full protection under Vance Capital's legal umbrella. It's time we give a voice to the 14 people whose stories were buried in the dark." In a modest, 2-story house on the suburban outskirts of Baltimore, Lydia Warren sat in her small home office, staring at the glowing television screen in disbelief. On the news, commentators were endlessly replaying the video of Julian Vance's removal from Flight 412. Beside her desk sat 3 large cardboard storage boxes, filled with old files, training manuals, and internal memos that she had kept ever since her firing from Apex Airways 3 years ago. When her phone rang with an unknown Chicago number, Lydia hesitated before answering. "Hello? Lydia Warren? My name is Devon Cole. I am calling on behalf of Julian Vance and Vance Capital." Lydia's heart beat faster against her ribs. "If you're calling about Apex Airways, Mr. Cole, I signed a non-disclosure agreement when I was terminated. If I speak publicly, their legal team will sue me for everything I own." "Miss Warren, Mr. Vance isn't asking you to put yourself in legal jeopardy," Devon replied gently. "Our chief legal counsel, Grace Mercer, has already reviewed your termination agreement. Because Apex Airways used fraudulent restructuring claims to conceal your whistleblowing, your NDA is legally unenforceable under federal protection laws. Mr. Vance wants to offer you full legal representation and a platform to finally tell the truth." An hour later, Lydia was sitting in front of her webcam, connected to a secure video conference with Julian Vance, Grace Mercer, and Devon Cole. Looking into the screen, Lydia saw Julian Vance sitting in his Chicago office. Despite his immense power, his eyes held a gentle, profound empathy that instantly put her at ease. "Thank you for speaking with us, Miss Warren," Julian said warmly. "I know how much courage it takes to stand up against an institution that tried to destroy your career." Lydia took a shaky breath, pulling a thick black binder out of one of her storage boxes and holding it up to the camera. "Mr. Vance, what happened to you on Flight 412 was built into the very foundation of Apex Airways' operational culture," Lydia explained, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "When I was director of compliance, I noticed a terrifying trend in our customer incident logs. Black passengers represented less than 12% of our first-class travelers, yet they accounted for over 60% of all passenger security verifications and removals." Lydia opened the binder and turned to a marked page containing a printed internal email. "When I brought this data to CEO Harrison Croft 3 years ago and requested an independent audit, he personally shut down the investigation. Look at this email, Mr. Vance." Grace Mercer zoomed in on the document displayed on her monitor. Dated 3 years prior and bearing Harrison Croft's digital signature, the email read, "Lydia, we are running a commercial airline, not a social crusade. The verification data simply reflects cultural behavior differences and crew risk assessment rather than employee bias. Pursuing an independent audit will create unnecessary legal liability and damage crew morale. Consider this matter closed." Grace Mercer let out a low, cold whistle. "That email is absolute gold," Grace said, her legal mind instantly recognizing the devastating impact of the document. "It proves that executive leadership had explicit knowledge of persistent discriminatory practices and deliberately chose to suppress the truth to protect corporate profits." Julian looked at the document, his expression solemn and deeply focused. "Miss Warren," Julian said softly, "you carried this burden alone for 3 years while they tried to convince the world that you were the problem. With your permission, Vance Capital will use this evidence to make sure no traveler ever has to suffer that humiliation again. Lydia felt tears prickling her eyes, a heavy weight that she had carried for 3 long years, finally lifting from her shoulders. "Use whatever you need, Mr. Vance," she whispered. "It's time they finally answer for what they did." By 11 o'clock the following morning, the media firestorm surrounding Apex Airways had reached a fever pitch. Stock prices for the airline were plummeting on Wall Street, down over 14% in early trading as major institutional investors began dumping their shares in panic. Ignoring the desperate advice of his vice president of communications, Sarah Jenkins, who had strongly urged him to issue a full retraction and step down quietly, CEO Harrison Croft decided to take matters into his own hands. Driven by his unyielding ego and a desperate desire to protect his reputation, Croft called a live televised press conference at the Apex Airways corporate headquarters in Dallas. The press room was packed wall to wall, with national news reporters, camera crews, and financial journalists. Bright television lights baked the stage, casting a harsh glare across the polished wooden podium. Harrison Croft stepped up to the microphones, dressed in a crisp 3-piece suit, his expression hardened into a mask of defensive arrogance. "Good morning," Croft began, his voice echoing loudly through the room. "I am speaking to you today to set the record straight regarding the unfortunate incident aboard Flight 412. Apex Airways has always maintained an unyielding commitment to safety, equality, and professional customer service. However, commercial aviation requires that flight crews possess absolute authority to manage cabin security." Croft leaned into the microphones, his eyes narrowing. "While we regret any discomfort experienced by Mr. Bidat, Vance, our lead flight attendant acted entirely within standard operational protocol after evaluating what she perceived to be an uncooperative atmosphere. Furthermore, recent allegations circulating online regarding our internal compliance history are being pushed by a disgruntled former employee, Lydia Warren, whose claims are completely devoid of factual merit." Before Croft could even finish his opening statement, an investigative reporter in the front row, Marcus Thorne from the National Financial Daily, stood up without waiting to be called on. "Mr. Croft!" Marcus shouted over the sound of clicking camera shutters. "You just claimed Miss Warren's allegations are devoid of factual merit. How do you explain this email, which was just released by Vance Capital's legal team 10 minutes ago?" Marcus held up a sheet of paper, reading the text aloud into the room. "The verification data simply reflects cultural behavior differences rather than employee bias. Mr. Croft, this email bears your personal signature from 3 years ago. Did you or did you not personally shut down an independent civil rights audit to protect your stock value?" The entire press room exploded into absolute chaos. Dozens of reporters stood up at once, shouting questions, while camera lenses zoomed in tightly on Croft's face. Croft's arrogant posture collapsed instantly. Under the blinding heat of the television lights, his face went ghostly pale, and heavy beads of sweat began pouring down his temples. He blinked rapidly, staring at the sea of shouting reporters like a man caught in a sudden, violent trap. That document is being taken completely out of context," Croft stammered, his voice cracking slightly as he gripped the edges of the podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. "That was an internal operational discussion regarding routine crew training metrics. What context makes it acceptable to attribute discriminatory removals to cultural behavior differences?" "Mr. Croft," another journalist yelled from the back, "are you going to resign today? How do you justify losing $4 billion in funding over persistent prejudice in your first-class cabins?" Croft opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The crushing, undeniable weight of his own written words had rendered his lies completely useless. Looking out at the flashing cameras, Croft realized that his career, his reputation, and his corporate legacy were disintegrating live on national television. Without saying another word, Croft backed away from the podium, turned around, and practically ran off the stage through a side exit, leaving his remaining PR team to face the furious barrage of questions alone. 3 hours after the press conference disaster, a private executive jet landed at Chicago O'Hare. Gavin Prescott, the senior chairman of the board for Apex Airways, walked quickly through the private terminal, accompanied only by the airline's chief legal counsel. Prescott was a broad-shouldered, gray-haired man of 68 who had spent his entire life navigating high-stakes corporate turnarounds. But as he entered the top-floor boardroom at Vance Capital, his face carried the deep, visible exhaustion of a man who knew his institution was hanging by a thread. Julian Vance was waiting for him, seated at the glass conference table alongside Grace Mercer and Lydia Warren. There were no news cameras in the room, no flashing lights, and no public relations advisors. There were only 4 people sitting in a quiet, sunlit space overlooking the city skyline. Prescott walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. He looked directly at Julian, then at Lydia, and let out a long, heavy breath. "Mr. Vance, Miss Warren," Prescott began, his voice low and sincere. "I am not here today to make corporate excuses or defend the indefensible. What happened to you on Flight 412 was an absolute disgrace, and what happened to Miss Warren 3 years ago was a moral failure on the part of this company's executive leadership." Prescott set a leather folder on the table. "The board of directors is prepared to offer you a formal, public apology signed by every board member. We are also prepared to offer Miss Warren a full financial restitution package of $10 million to settle her wrongful termination claims quietly." Julian looked at Prescott, his expression entirely calm, his eyes steady and penetrating. "Mr. Prescott, if you came to Chicago believing that money can buy a quiet cover-up for a persistent culture of humiliation, you have severely misunderstood who you are sitting across from." Prescott shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. Vance, the airline is facing total operational collapse. Our stock has plummeted 30%, our lenders are panicking, and if Vance Capital pulls the AeroCore software license, our entire fleet will be grounded by Friday. We are willing to give you whatever financial terms you want to restore the $4 billion credit facility." Julian leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the glass table. "Money will not buy back your credit facility, Mr. Prescott. Dignity is not a commodity that can be negotiated in a settlement. If Apex Airways wishes to survive, these are my non-negotiable terms." Julian pointed to Grace Mercer, who handed Prescott a single sheet of paper containing 5 clear points. The immediate, unconditional termination of CEO Harrison Croft without a severance payout. The complete, public release of all 14 past settlement records and internal compliance audits. The establishment of an independent passenger review board holding absolute authority over cabin safety policies to be chaired personally by Lydia Warren. Mandatory, comprehensive civil rights re-education for every flight crew member, ground agent, and executive officer in the company. A $50 million endowment fund established by Apex Airways to support scholarships for underrepresented youth pursuing careers in commercial aviation. Prescott read the document slowly, his jaw dropping in shock. "Mr. Vance, these terms will fundamentally alter how our entire company operates from top to bottom. It will cost hundreds of millions of dollars." Julian looked Prescott dead in the eyes, his voice ringing with quiet, undeniable power. "Prejudice has already cost innocent passengers their dignity for over a decade, Mr. Prescott. You have until 6 o'clock tomorrow morning to accept every single condition. If you refuse, Vance Capital will terminate your software license, pull the $4 billion permanently, and watch your airline dissolve into history." The following afternoon, while the board of directors at Apex Airways was locked in a fierce, late-night debate over Julian's non-negotiable terms, a surprising visitor arrived at the reception desk of Vance Capital in Chicago. Flight attendant Victoria Hayes stood in the lobby, dressed in plain civilian clothes, a simple navy coat, and a dark sweater. She wore no makeup, her eyes were red and swollen from hours of crying, and she carried no corporate legal team or union representatives with her. She had personally requested a short meeting with Julian Vance, fully expecting to be turned away at the door. To her surprise, Devin Cole walked out to the lobby and quietly escorted her into a private side conference room. A moment later, Julian Vance walked in, accompanied only by Grace Mercer. Victoria stood up nervously, her hands trembling so hard she had to slide them into her coat pockets. She looked at Julian, the man she had interrogated, judged, and thrown off. Flight 412, and for the first time she saw him clearly. Not as a security risk, not as an uncomfortable presence in first class, but as a human being of profound, dignified, quiet strength. "Mr. Vance," Victoria began, her voice cracking with deep emotion, I didn't come here today to ask for my job back. I know I'm going to be fired, and I know I deserve it." Julian sat down across from her, watching her quietly. "Why are you here, Victoria?" Victoria took a shaky breath, tears spilling over her lashes and running down her cheeks. "Because I've rewatched that video 1,000 times in the last 48 hours, Mr. Vance. And every single time I watch it, I hate the person I see standing in that aisle." She swallowed hard, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. "When I saw you sitting in seat 2A that morning, I didn't see a passenger who had paid for his ticket. I saw someone who didn't fit my narrow idea of what a first-class traveler should look like. I convinced myself I was just following procedure and ensuring cabin safety. But the truth is, I made a cruel, prejudiced assumption about you the second I looked at you. And I used my authority to humiliate you because you had the courage to question me." Grace Mercer watched Victoria closely, evaluating the sincerity of her words. Julian remained still, his expression thoughtful, his eyes searching Victoria's face for any sign of corporate performance. He saw none. All he saw was a woman who had finally been forced to confront the dark, subconscious bias she had carried for years. "An apology cannot undo the humiliation I felt when security grabbed my arm in front of 50 people, Victoria," Julian said softly, his voice devoid of anger, but heavy with truth. "Nor can it undo the harm done to the 14 other travelers who were made to feel like trespassers in spaces they earned the right to occupy." "I know," Victoria sobbed, bowing her head in shame. "I know it can't. But I wanted you to hear from my own mouth that I am deeply, profoundly sorry. I am testifying fully before the Civil Rights Review Board tomorrow. I am telling them everything about how crew members were subtly encouraged to monitor passengers of color in premium cabins. I don't care if I never work in aviation again. I just want to do the right thing." Julian looked at her for a long moment. Then he offered a small, gentle nod. "Remorse only matters if it transforms how you treat human beings for the rest of your life, Victoria," Julian said quietly. "If you tell the whole truth tomorrow without making excuses for yourself or the airline, then this painful mistake can become the moment you finally choose to grow." Victoria wiped her eyes, looking up at Julian with profound gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me, even when I failed to see you." At 5:30 a.m. the following morning, 30 minutes before Julian's deadline was set to expire, the board of directors at Apex Airways concluded their emergency session. The vote was absolute and unanimous. At 6 a.m. sharp, Harrison Croft arrived at the Apex Airways corporate headquarters in Dallas, attempting to use his executive keycard to enter the private underground parking garage. The electronic scanner flashed crimson red and let out a sharp, metallic error beep. Before Croft could even roll down his window, 2 broad-shouldered corporate security officers stepped out from the security booth. The lead officer approached Croft's car, his face stone cold. "Mr. Croft, your executive access has been revoked," the officer stated plainly. "By order of the board of directors, you have been terminated as Chief Executive Officer of Apex Airways, effective immediately. You are barred from entering company premises." Croft's face contorted in disbelief and fury. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Croft shouted, slamming his hand against the steering wheel. "I built this airline. Call Gavin Prescott right now." "Mr. Prescott authorized this order, sir," the officer replied calmly, handing Croft a sealed white envelope through the window. "Your personal belongings from your office have already been boxed and sent to your home residence. Please turn around and exit the property immediately, or we will have local law enforcement remove you for trespassing." Croft stared at the sealed envelope in absolute shock. He turned his car around and drove away, caught in a pouring rainstorm that matched his inner devastation. There were no news cameras waiting to capture his exit, no supportive board members, and no million-dollar golden parachute waiting in his bank account. His unyielding arrogance, his cruel dismissal of human dignity, and his desperate attempt to cover up persistent prejudice had stripped him of everything he had spent 40 years building. 2 hours later, board chairman Gavin Prescott stood before a national television audience, flanked by Grace Mercer and Lydia Warren. Prescott read a formal, unscripted statement accepting every single one of Julian Vance's non-negotiable terms. Apex Airways acknowledges that for over a decade, our operational culture failed to uphold the fundamental dignity of our passengers, Prescott announced to the nation, his voice steady and resolute. We failed to listen to brave whistleblowers like Lydia Warren who tried to warn us. Today, we take full responsibility for those failures. Effective immediately, Miss Warren has been appointed as the chair of our new Independent Passenger Oversight Board, holding absolute authority to reform crew training, cabin policies, and passenger equity across our entire global fleet. The news sent shockwaves through the corporate world. Financial analysts declared it a watershed moment in aviation history, a moment where a major corporation was finally forced to dismantle its underlying structures of prejudice, not through empty corporate PR, but through the overwhelming, crushing power of economic accountability. 4 years later, on a bright, sunny afternoon, Julian Vance walked quietly through the newly renovated Terminal 2 at Chicago O'Hare. The airline, which had been fully restructured and rebranded as Elevation Air under Lydia Warren's oversight, looked and felt like a completely different world. Julian wore his usual modest travel attire, dark jeans, a navy jacket, a plain button-down shirt, and a simple baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He carried no security detail, no entourage, and no corporate fanfare. He walked unhurriedly through the terminal, enjoying the quiet anonymity that allowed him to observe the world as it truly was. The terminal was filled with warm afternoon sunlight streaming through wide glass ceilings. As Julian passed Gate 4, the very gate where his journey had begun 4 years earlier, he paused to watch the bustling activity around him. The atmosphere in the terminal was remarkably warm and human. Near the counter, a young customer service agent was helping an elderly traveler who appeared confused about his gate assignment. "Take all the time you need, sir," the agent said with a warm, genuine smile. "We're going to make sure you get to your seat safely and comfortably." A few yards away, near the floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the tarmac, an 8-year-old black girl with bright, cheerful eyes and blue ribbons tied in her hair was standing beside her mother. The little girl was leaning her hands against the glass, staring out at a massive Boeing 787 jet parked at the gate. Walking down the jet bridge toward the plane was the flight's captain, a tall, confident black woman dressed in a crisp pilot's uniform, 4 bright gold stripes shining proudly on her shoulders. The little girl pointed through the glass, her face lighting up with pure wonder. "Mommy, look!" the child gasped excitedly. "The captain looks just like me. Can girls really fly big airplanes like that?" Her mother knelt beside her, wrapping a loving arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Girls can fly those planes, sweetheart," the mother said softly, her voice filled with pride. "And girls can build the companies that own them, too. Don't you ever let anyone tell you that you don't belong in first class." The female pilot happened to look through the terminal glass, saw the little girl pointing at her, and paused. She smiled warmly, raised her hand, and gave the little girl a bright, encouraging wave before stepping onto the aircraft. The little girl giggled with pure joy, waving back with both arms. Julian stood a few feet away, watching the exchange quietly. A soft, profound warmth spread through his chest, and his eyes glistened with quiet emotion. He remembered the cold, metallic pressure of Officer Thorne's hand pulling him from Seat 2A. He remembered the arrogant smirk on Arthur Pembroke's face, the hostile interrogation from Victoria Hayes, and the painful humiliation of being locked out in the jet bridge while 50 passengers watched in silence. That deep, personal pain had once felt like an open wound, but as he watched that little girl beaming at the captain through the glass, Julian realized that true healing never erases the past, It simply transforms the pain into a higher, greater purpose. His humiliation had become the catalyst that dismantled a decade of hidden injustice. It had built a world where no little girl, no elderly traveler, and no innocent human being would ever have to prove their right to be treated with simple human dignity. Julian's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a text message from Lydia Warren, who was now serving as the chief operating officer of the newly transformed airline. "The board meeting is starting in 10 minutes, Julian. Everyone is waiting for you." Julian offered a small, serene smile. He typed a quick reply, "Tell them I'm already here. I was just making sure the sky belongs to everyone." Julian slid his phone back into his pocket, straightened his jacket, and turned toward the executive elevator. He walked with the light, effortless stride of a man who had fought the darkness of prejudice with the quiet, unyielding power of dignity and won. If Julian's journey reminded you that every human being deserves respect, dignity, and equality regardless of their status or appearance, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. By joining our community, you help us share more inspiring stories about courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what is right. What would you have done if you were sitting in seat 2A that morning? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, real strength isn't measured by the power you hold over others, but by the dignity you extend to everyone around you. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.